Welcome to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast, your guide to future tech trends and innovation in a language you understand. Now, over to your host, Neil Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast. How are we all doing, gang? You know, it often amazes me how we manage to find enough material to tackle a completely different topic every single day on this podcast about how technology is transforming our life. Now, today, I want to tackle something that will affect each and every person listening, and also every business too. And that's identity, or should I say, managing identity. Because GDPR has been in place for over a year now, and a 4% fine on turnover can be incredibly expensive. I mean, just ask British Airways, who were fined 183 million recently. But a compliance that promised to deliver trust, transparency, and openness has made the internet somewhat of a chore. For example, it sometimes feels like you have to click or swipe 3 to 5 agreements just to reach the content that you were looking for. And it's especially odd to me, especially when we compare it with the rise of the so-called experience economy. But it is an incredibly complex subject. So I invited Nick Caley, VP of Financial Services and Regulatory at ForgeRock, onto the show to explore in much more detail. So buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to London to speak with Nick about identity, managing identity, GDPR, standing on a giant boulder wedged in a mountain crevice, and so much more. And if that doesn't have you intrigued, nothing will. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Nick. Can you tell the listeners a little more about who you are and what you do?
Thank you very much, Neil. No, it's a real pleasure to be spending some time with you and sharing some thoughts around information security, because that's what I've been doing for about the last 22 years, from the very beginnings of the internet. And currently I'm VP of Financial Services and Regulatory for Fordrock, which is a digital identity company.
So presumably you've seen a lot of changes then over those 22 years.
Dramatic changes. The internet becoming an everyday part of everyone's lives. The way that we've used online services has changed significantly. Obviously, the rise of mobile has been a feature of that. Just the sheer number of apps that I think are involved in everybody's sort of day-to-day.
Absolutely. And we are living, of course, in an age where identity is at the absolute centre of everything now. But for people hearing about us talk about ForgeRock for the very first time, can you share a little more about the kind of problems it is that you solve for your customers?
Yeah, in fact, most people will be interacting with ForgeRock's technology even without realising it. Because in essence, ForgeRock's providing a capability to getting on for nearly 1,000 global brands. Some of these are, high street names, well recognised. The BBC is a great example of an organisation that's working with ForgeRock, and particularly around protecting the identity of their customers. And we see that across governments, banks, media, telco, across all the sectors, into healthcare as well. So anywhere where there's sensitive data associated with an individual is where ForgeRock's technology is helping to secure that. But interestingly, we spend a lot of time focused around making the digital experience that much easier and more convenient, whilst also making it secure. So that's registering for a service, signing up, logging in, all those different logins with usernames and passwords, and now the increasing number of options around using a biometric like a touch or a face ID, for example. ForgeRock supports all of that. So it's interesting times as so many companies are looking at transforming themselves digitally to be competitive.
Now, one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast today was to explore what you've learned about GDPR. I mean, it's been in now for over a year, and BA, British Airways, have recently been hit by the biggest GDPR fine to date, I think nearly 183 million. But can you tell me more about why you think the internet experience in Europe has actually been degraded and is a perfect example of how the law of unintended consequences?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think for everybody, we've all witnessed, our use of the internet becoming more of a challenge than we'd all want it to be. And certainly it's kind of, I think the whole nature of it being a world wide web is no longer the case. We saw that literally overnight as a lot of the marketing aspects of engaging with an online portal or going to favorite newspaper online, all had to shift to recognize this new world of GDPR. So I think it's been a bit of a wake-up call for everybody. Every time you go onto a web page, you're literally going to be hit by a privacy policy, a consent sort of cookie management pop-up. And in essence, what that's asking you to do is take a good look at who actually is going to access that data after you've shared it with them. So if you didn't turn any of those off, it could be as many as 300 providers in the background that are somehow, using that data to feed ads to you. So I think that has really become a lot more. It's become a lot more transparent as to what's happening to personal data, and some of that has been perhaps some paranoia just in terms of the strength of the fine. Clearly, when a company is looking at 4% of global revenue, and we can see with BA, 183 million is going to get the notice of pretty much every board of every company globally. So I think, it's clear to see that the game has changed, and it's in these kind of penalties and fines that we see just how much that has changed. But I think for each individual person using the internet, there's no doubt it's become more frustrating, but I think that's a point in time. It's been a knee-jerk response. I don't think it's really about the innovation that could be done around consumer data, which could make it a much more pleasant experience for people.
Yeah, and that's the word, I think, experience, because we are living in the age of digital experiences and customer experience and one-click baskets, removing as many steps as possible, removing all those friction points, and yet just going to any website becomes a bit of a chore, doesn't it, at the moment?
Yeah, it does, and it doesn't need to be that way. I think there's a dynamic that is actually opening up a commercial opportunity to just have a different relationship with a customer, and that's really around making it transparent as to what you would want to do with their data. And actually, we call this the privacy personalization paradox. So I want a much more personal experience of the internet, but I don't want to sacrifice my privacy. Am I having to trade one off for the other? What does a more personal internet experience look like? Well, I want you to know that I've landed in my holiday destination, and you're going to serve up my favorite cuisine with the best restaurant options because I'm sharing my location. That is a very personal experience. And I think we'd all like, the personal concierge that could guide us around the world into the best experiences. I think that remains a commercial opportunity, and it's based around, when I share more data with you, what are you doing with it? Let me see who you're going to share that data with, who's in your ecosystem of supply chain and partners that you want to share the data with to increase the value of the experience I'm having using your service. So I think that's kind of where we are right now, and I'm expecting that to change. Some of the projects we're involved with are pointing in the direction of some real innovation about using consumer data with their consent to offer a much better digital experience.
And I suppose on a more positive note, consumers do really seem to be waking up to data privacy as a result. But do you think that GDPR has caused these changes in consumer attitudes and behaviour when it actually comes to privacy, or do you think it's something else?
I think it's a combination of factors that, it's the way these things happen. It's kind of like buses, they come along three at once. And, what's true to say is that it was the combination of GDPR going live, and that raising awareness, across the population. But I think equally, it's been in the high-profile data breaches that we've seen going on, and notably Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, which clearly the FTC in the States just last week fined Facebook a record fine of $5 billion, which barely touches the surface of their deep profit, but in essence is a wake-up call to that organization. And in fact, there are some very stringent penalties associated with that fine. They have to report for a period of 20 years on their privacy, and it's now being taken out of the hands of Mark Zuckerberg and put into an independent panel to review. So I think actually consumer awareness has been driven by just what organizations of scale are doing with our data. I think the public are waking up to the fact that data is extremely valuable, And actually, I think there's some analysis of, the value associated with that data, and a monetary value even. And maybe that's the path forward, is recognizing that consumer data has a monetary value, and somehow in the future we'll be earning some pocket money from that.
So as a result of GDPR, are you finding that companies are struggling with data integration, or has it been much easier than they originally expected?
That's a great question, because, the way that data has just grown exponentially in volume has been and remains an ongoing challenge for organizations to manage, to store, to secure, to retrieve. And actually that challenge isn't going away, because the amount of data that's being collected is continuing to grow. So I think, in fact, that remains one of the challenges to be solved. It's where we spend a lot of our time working with our customers, ensuring that they can take a much more automated approach to that substantial challenge of managing the data of their personal data of their employees, their partners and subcontractors, and particularly their customers, which obviously gets into the scale of the many millions. And it is sensitive data, it's personally identifiable information. But the thing is that it's just sitting in so many different systems. It's, through outsourcing and offshoring and cloud, and the expanse of cloud services means that you've got pockets of customer data sitting in numerous systems, maybe hundreds, if not thousands of systems, that to a large degree are disconnected when you need them to be connected. So we've done a lot of work to essentially connect up these pockets of high value credentials and ensure that an organization has a master identity record that they can associate with an individual customer. And that's not just about GDPR compliance, it's also about just being a bit more personal with your individual customer, so that one customer in perhaps 10 million feels that you know them when they turn up on their mobile app, or when they're trying to sign up for a new service, that actually there's some recognition that you don't need to ask them for their address, because you do recognize they've been a customer for 5 or 6 years already. And so it's those little parts of our day-to-day experience that the underlying piece is that data integration. And I think, for many enterprises, that remains an ongoing challenge, and one that we are excited about helping them address.
Now, as someone that reads far too many articles online, one subject I am seeing more and more is that consumer ownership is the data of future. There's a lot of people debating this at the moment, but do you think that's the case?
Oh, I think it's the case right now. I mean, I think actually that what shifted dramatically is the ownership of data, and actually what we're going to witness over what we've seen through the year of GDPR, and what we're going to see over the next 10, 15, 20 years is that shift to a fully enabled consumer ownership of data. And I say that because when I go all the way back to when I first got started, some 20 plus years ago, that was when the first original data protection law came into being. And even as I look back at the 20 years that was in existence, companies were still struggling to really do the right thing with that personal data. And we saw the rise of data breaches as they became reported on. And I think we're going to continue to see GDPR play out for a decade more, and it will be around recognizing that if a customer wants to do something with their data, then they need to be able to do that, and they need to be able to switch it to another provider very easily, which is written up as part of GDPR. They need to delete an account just as easily, which is obviously a significant challenge. Going back, Neil, to what you were saying about data integration, if someone's wanting to delete their account, that presents a number of challenges just in terms of, can I delete everything associated with them? Am I going to go to backup tapes? So that's a complex picture, but it does need to be solved, and solved to the satisfaction of the person who wanted to delete all the data out of that account provider, which might actually, in BA's case, have been the response they had to deal with when people realized that their data had been breached. I'm sure many people were saying, I'd like my data deleted out of your systems now. So it's an interesting time. I think there's recognition that consumers own their data, particularly across Europe, and further afield, we're seeing other territories, other countries now recognizing their own privacy laws, and that would be in countries like Brazil and India and Thailand and even the US, where we're starting to see some of the states like California and Nevada picking up a focus around data privacy. So in essence, I think that the game is changing. Certainly in Europe, consumer ownership of data is very much written into the law, and now it's a matter of, I think, organizations recognizing that there is a commercial opportunity associated with a very clear exchange of value around that data, more transparency, more visibility, more control, and more convenience in what a customer wants to do with that data.
And if we just move away from GDPR for a moment, I recently came across the ForgeRock Consumer Data Breach Report. So for anyone listening that hasn't seen that, can you tell me more about how weak identity access management strategies are actually costing businesses billions right now?
Yeah, our report came out and very focused on the US market, where there is a continual drumbeat of data breaches that are becoming public knowledge, and it's in the US, data breach notification has been there since 2006. And we've continually seen the number and the scale of these data breaches. I think that for me was one of the call-outs of the report. And what it points to, particularly from Fordrock's perspective, is that actually protecting credentials, just the usernames, the passwords, the addresses, the social security numbers, the date of births, all of the things that we get asked for, plus the transaction history, perhaps our credit card numbers, our passport numbers. All of these are these pieces of data. They matter to an individual. They matter in terms of potential fraud that might be carried out once an identity has been stolen. There are some significant impacts to individuals that get caught up in these large-scale data breaches. So what might appear as a headline to us of 140 million credentials being breached, in reality, for a percentage of that, there are some real-life issues that are presented to these people when their identity is being stolen and being used fraudulently to open cards and spend on credit cards that they never actually had themselves. So, I think there is a recognition that identity and access management, the security of ensuring that you are who you say you are, you're on the right device, it's the right time of day, you're in the right location, and you're doing the right things, all of those real contextual, real-time signals are something that ForgeRock enables our customers to understand instantly, and to be able to provide a level of assurance that it is that customer, that employee, that partner who should have access to that system to do something with that data, that sort of end-to-end journey can both be delivered securely, but also that we can make it convenient and put an appropriate level of friction. So what do I mean by that? If you're a systems administrator, then inevitably we're going to be asking you for a biometric when you're about to access something that has massive implications for the organization, should there be any kind of an error or any kind of an exposure of that data. So you should expect that you're going to be asked for a biometric at the point of access, that we're going to do a step-up authentication. And some of this is now becoming relevant for the way that consumers access and authorize some of their transactions, particularly in the banking sphere. So I think the report was great at just raising awareness, and these reports, whether it's a Verizon report or whether it's ForgeRock, I think they raise awareness for the decision makers in IT companies to really recognize that actually the days of just doing something homegrown, where you built a system that now is creaking at the seams because it's having to manage 10 million, 15 million, 20 million, in some cases more than 100 million users, with all the associated devices that they're trusting to act on their behalf. And now we have consent management, which has come in through laws like GDPR. I think all of that just begs for a very different approach, a modern approach, modernizing with a platform that is able to integrate with legacy systems, able to present a master identity record, and then in all of those day-to-day interactions is able to secure exactly who is that person who is gaining access under what conditions. And yet that's all getting a green light, so it becomes a much more seamless and less frictionful experience.
And a question I've got to ask, of course, is: was there anything in the report that personally surprised you?
Well,
you've seen it all.
I have. Yeah, not a great deal. I've been deeply involved in data security since, I guess, well, from the early days of filtering emails. So what was the focus there with email was that companies wanted to protect themselves from what was likely to come in via email. And now I've seen and witnessed that shift into what's going out, so the loss of data. And so being involved in data security, I think I'm not surprised by these reports. I think the surprise for me is that in 2019, we are still finding in these data breach incidents that just some of the basic fundamentals are not being done, like encrypting passwords, making it difficult for hackers. And look, I'm someone who's been working alongside security teams globally for years and years. So I recognize the difficult task that's presented to a chief information security officer. In fact, I think that they have one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult job in IT, simply because they're challenged by innovation on the one side, lots of new services coming on stream, lots of new cloud-based services where data is going to go out and be stored and processed. And then they've got the attackers that are looking every single day to somehow get onto that network. And so I think that the surprise for me is that just some of the fundamental building blocks of getting security right are still being left, enabling a hacker to have an easier path into data that they shouldn't get access to. And I'd really like to see those doors and windows closed and only open to people who should actually be able to access.
And something else that caught my attention was I think ForgeRock recently announced the availability of an open banking accelerators for the banking and payment ecosystem, including third-party providers, and enabling them to jumpstart compliance with UK and related open banking standards. But can you tell me how this speeds deployment and reduces costs of compliance, just for any business leaders listening?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a fascinating area to be involved with. And actually, our conversation around GDPR, if you keep that in your mind, when you think about PSD2 and open banking, what's happening is it's that realization of data ownership. So it's saying that me as a banking customer, I'd like to get more insights from the data that is just going through my account. So all the transactions, where I'm spending my money, what I'm spending my money on, kind of what my account balance is at the end of the month, and whether that puts me into an overdraft. And so now we're living in a world where, mobile analytics capabilities, the cloud, have enabled a whole array of fintech, financial technology companies, startups that are able to interact with this data and give us a lot of real-time insights. And the banks are also stepping into that as well. And that's really where PSD2 and open banking is coming. It's the ability that an individual customer has to securely share their banking data with a third party, so their account information. And then equally that there's innovation around the payments that we're making, so that no longer does it need to be with a credit card, with the associated charges that go with that. We could actually pay it direct from our bank account. And you're going to see that become an innovation that's going to be, it's already happening. So ForgeRock's been instrumental in open banking around the world, particularly in the UK. We've been involved with it for over 3 years. And really the open banking accelerator is us listening closely and witnessing the challenges that our customers at scale, with billions of pounds of payments going through their systems, managing millions of accounts, the challenges that they faced in order to build an architecture that can both be compliant with the open banking specifications, but equally can give them a commercial opportunity in providing new services and delivering those to new customers that will be looking for those kind of insights, those real-time insights. So the accelerators really are a design pattern. It's a reference architecture. It's code. It's configuration. Essentially, there's a whole array of assets that we've put into these kits that we've made available with some deployment support services. And in one example, I know a customer who has achieved a 60% increase in their time to value, their time to the outcome of their project by using the accelerator kit. So I think there's measurable benefits in terms of using this kit to kind of address the requirements for building an architecture that will support open banking. And open banking is at the very beginning. We're going to see, I think this has become a very mainstream activity for all of us in our the way we interact with payments and banking information, and it'll become mainstream over the next five years.
So what is your primary focus at ForgeRock right now? Is there anything else you can share about the road ahead? I understand you're probably limited as to what you can share at the moment, but are there any teasers you can offer?
Yeah, so I think indeed, and as I've shared already, that we're at a fascinating point in time where you have large pieces of regulation and law affecting, whether it's Australia going live with their version of their own kind of consumer data right, which has some open banking in it. So these pieces of regulation are kind of they're a baseline at which enterprises will need to operate. But for us at ForgeRock, I think we've always been focused on over the horizon. What lies beyond? What's the next wave of disruptive technology, of challenges that are going to be presented to a chief information officer trying to figure out, what is the path to profitability for their enterprise, and how do they navigate some fairly choppy waters of whether it's regulation or whether it's consumer expectation and then the competition and the rise of these digital startups. So for us, I think the basic block and tackle of identity and access management is where we're brutally focused right now, and it's to address what we've seen in our data breach report, the fundamentals of securing millions of individuals' high-value credentials. What's interesting about that is our ability to provide a single view of that customer's identity. So whether they started their interaction with a service provider on mobile and then shifted to the web and then it became a bit more complicated, so they then rang the customer call center, our customers are now able to recognize that customer at each point of their journey and pick up the conversation from that point. So the need for security questions every time you call in is beginning to disappear because of our technology. So that, I think, is a real continuing focus for us around that single view of the customer, both from the front office contact with a customer, also to the back office connections with huge numbers of different pockets of personal information sitting across the enterprise. And for me, where that gets really interesting is IoT and 5G. So we're on the cusp of seeing 5G network come online. That's going to radically alter the way that we experience the web, as long as the pop-ups don't get in the way, obviously. But what we've also got happening is IoT, and then we've got some really interesting things happening around healthcare, and then you've got mobility with the connected car. Many of us will be driving around in cars that have a SIM and that are connected back to base with the with the dealer or the manufacturer, and that's only going to become more the case as car manufacturers recognize that there are more opportunities for them to look at the kind of mobile and what's happened around Apple and Samsung and Google with their ability to create all of these additional services. And I think cars are going to go much the same way, particularly when we don't have to drive any longer. So for me, that IoT, the array of personal devices that we begin to trust around us that can act on our behalf. So making a payment, my car might make a payment for me as I'm going into a parking garage, for example, or paying for fuel, or paying for a toll, or even going in and having maintenance. So that's all ahead of us, but it's enabled by these technologies like IoT and 5G. And so for ForgeRock, we've always been innovators looking at the next horizon. And I think we definitely have got current capabilities today that enable integrity around the data that's coming off a car moving at 70 miles an hour, such that we can all feel a little safer when that's happening. And that ability to be able to map, devices, sensors, connected cars into the enterprise with trust continues to be a focus for us and will be going forward.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for coming on and sharing this with me today. But before I do let you go, a question I've got to ask is, before we started talking, I was having a little browse on your social channels, and I noticed the header image was of a man stood on a giant boulder wedged between two cliffs. Now, I've stood on that exact same rock a few years ago in Norway, so I've got to ask, was that you in that picture?
You've stood on that rock, have you?
Yes, yeah, about 3 years ago in Norway.
Wow, that's incredible. No, I haven't. That actually remains an ambition of mine, since it is, within ForgeRock.
Yes.
Clearly that's where the name comes from, and that glacial boulder that's literally trapped between these two cliffs almost is, it's fascinating. And many of our founders have, and many of the people at ForgeRock have been up there, obviously.
Yeah.
So I'd like to do the same. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, a huge thanks again for joining me. But can you, just before I do let you go again, could you remind the listeners of where they can find you online and also contact your team if they've got any questions at all?
Yeah, really easily. So ForgeRock.com, you'll find us online. There's a large amount of resources that we provide just simply because of the knowledge we've gained over the last 9 years. And if you have any specific questions or want to engage us directly, then just the email address is info@ForgeRock.com.
Excellent. Well, I'll have those links to the blog post that accompanies this podcast, just so people can find it nice and easily as well. I think we've covered so much ground today, starting with that personalization paradox, IoT devices, 5G. We could have spent another half hour talking about this, I'm sure. But a big thank you for sharing that with me today. Thank you, Nick.
Happy to, Neil. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Wow, Nick covered so much ground there. And like I said in the interview, I think we barely scratched the surface. We could have easily talked for another couple of hours. But it certainly makes you realise just how far-reaching our personal data and our identity is now, especially when it's being carried across multiple devices, websites, apps. And it's so important to remember that this is going to explode and expand even further when we start adding IoT sensors everywhere we walk that are connected through fast 5G connections. And for consumers right now, it can feel that rather than that experience that we were promised of new era of data transparency, the most noticeable impact of the new data regulation has been a significant worsening in our internet experience, if we're completely honest. But the ForgeRock identity platform is trying to transform how companies interact securely with their customers, with their employees and things. Ultimately, and ensure that experience remains. So I'll pop all the details that we discussed in today's podcast over on my website, techblogwriter.co.uk. But remember, if you have any feedback, any questions, or if you've got something that you want to add to today's conversation, email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, or you can tweet me, of course, at Neil C. Hughes. But once again, we're out of time. I'm going to return tomorrow with another guest, and we're going to tackle another topic of how technology is transforming business or transforming our life. But before I go away and do all that, a big thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thanks for listening to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast. Until next time, remember, technology is best when it brings people together.